what happened here is our question. And unless we're observing the fire behavior, then we fall prey to what other ecologists have fallen prey to for 150 years, telling stories about what happened. Okay, so let's take this. The first way to look at this is, how does fire actually kill trees? And the way that we started to address this problem in that paper was looking at the evidence and where we are with understanding how does a tree actually die in fire? And it's we don't actually know that very well. There are pretty major camps in our field. The physiologists that have decided to dip their feet in this topic are in camps. Some of the camps have some overlap, but there are pretty equal camps on what we would all say from our sort of basic understanding of tree biology, that there's some damage to the vascular system. The cambium, the phloem or xylem are damaged in some way from the heat, because of course the heat comes across that bark surface, just like we all of course know. We'll talk about that in a second. There's recent work over the last 5 years that suggests that, as we were just talking in the back of the room, that the xylem undergoes some pretty dramatic effects. In that first picture I started with that the pretty intense fire was generating pretty strong vapor pressure deficits, and a lot of the work that's been done recently has looked at, in essence, the plumbing being deformed. Xylem deformation because of really, really high pull from the atmosphere. You have flames, or you have steam, which is kind of interesting, outside of that leaf that's being bathed in that convective heat. There's pretty good evidence that there's some dysfunction with the xylem, bending of the pipes. And there's always been, and if there is someone who works on bark beetles in the room, if forest pathologists in general can't hear a talk on post-fire tree mortality because they are just like, well, it's all beetles. But there's always been this second level, what people will call second order fire effects, or they will attribute it to this classic decline disease spiral, that it is a series of insults that results in mortality. There are some predisposing factors. There's some inciting factor, the fire, and then there are these contributing factors that would be attack by bark beetles. But as you can see, if you can imagine under this, there are 3 recent reviews that all don't come to the same conclusion. They all point to, we have to know a lot more about it. And from somebody who works on this and who's worked on it for, if your math is correct, 25 years, that's pretty troubling. The basis of our field, we don't really know the answer to. Okay, let's just put that aside, because mechanisms, we don't even need it. We're just going to focus on the patterns. Let's keep on going. Let's just ignore that for a second. Okay, you see how troubling this is? All right, think about your own field. Okay, and so if we bounce from the mechanisms, we're going to come back to the mechanisms. We bounce from the mechanisms into the pattern. The way that we have measured mortality for literally decades has been this very simple and frustrating outcome: a binary logistic regression. A binary outcome, you're either alive or dead, and you suffer some spectrum of an injury, and that injury results in death or life. From an analytical standpoint, that's really, really frustrating. If you think about all the things that you study, I hope for all of you, and I remember when I was an undergrad doing that work, I was really frustrated because the analysis was not what I was taught. I was taught I'm going to have some treatments, or I'm going to have a nice variation and be able to put a line through some dots. That's my introductory statistics. And I remember there being something about binary data and how difficult it was. And once I did that work, I said, forget this. The analysis is a nightmare. It's not very informative. Hopefully, and this is where the value of logistic regression for us is, we find a threshold where you basically step off of a threshold, and that beyond that, there's mortality. In all of these, what you'll tend to see is, and these are data points here, you tend to see data points that look like this. There's some over here on the before the threshold, there's some over here after the threshold, and we have metrics to say how good or poor those fits are. But basically, this binary outcome. It may seem trivial, but it actually is pretty catastrophic. And we built our models on this. This is how we predict tree mortality, whether you're using basically any software you're using to try to determine or predict tree mortality is based on this equation. So this equation has these predictors. It has a predictor of crown injury based on either a measured value or a modeled value. It has something about stem injury, and it may have something about root injury. So we've broken the tree now into 3 neat little parts. One is beneath ground, and so it is insulated literally and figuratively from some heat. We have the stem that we were all taught, and we know, of course, that is where the poor little vascular cambium is. And then we have that crown that is really far up, but somehow is a really, really apparent injury, which is a real value to our field. It's not like they get injured and you say they must have suffered some internal injury. We can't determine it. With trees, we have a really awesome external indicator of injury. That's the first good news of the afternoon. Okay, and then the other part that we enter, so these are 3 injuries, and then we have some characteristic of the tree itself, and that is a bark thickness, but it's actually a bark thickness based as some function, some allometric relationship with diameter and bark thickness. That's how the models actually work. You're not entering in a bark thickness. That picture is there to make you question that a little bit. We'll come back to what bark thickness means. Okay, so let's go through each of those as we descend into what we know about tree mortality. I'm spoiling the remainder of the talk with this first bullet. The greatest single predictor, if you only had one predictor of mortality, for almost every single tree mortality study we've ever done anywhere, it would be crown injury, and more specifically, it would be the proportion of that crown, its volume, that is browned by the fire. That's awesome. The field, in spite of the data, the field denies this. And I'll show you some evidence, just how strong the evidence is, which is great because I said it's the most apparent. So we've got the most apparent injury and we've got the most informative. That's a great, again, we're getting some really good news now. The problem with crown injury is that as a fire ecologist and as someone who focuses on tree mortality, I don't use the same terms that other people do, not just in other places in the world, but in our own field, in our own organizations. We argue about the terminology. The terminology matters. This image here is from a review we did a couple of years ago on crown injury that was trying to seek consensus and get to a point where we could say, here's why it matters. And the data will say crown scorch. All post-fire tree mortality data will have a crown scorch variable. But crown scorch is different from crown kill. I'll talk a little bit about this, and different from crown consumption. We've always had the differentiation of crown consumption. Crown consumption is the leaves were on fire. They consumed. They lost mass that's beyond their beyond dehydration. So you can see here the base of this beautiful, I did not draw, ponderosa pine. The leaves are shorter. They've obviously been, they've lost some leaf area. And in that, we know what the injury is pretty well. And we also know that even really, really fire tolerant species cannot handle crown consumption. Longleaf pine, even if you've never seen longleaf pine, if you know anything about fire ecology, longleaf pine is the poster child for a super resistant individual species. Longleaf pine cannot take more than 10% crown consumption. We think that reason, that super low threshold, is because it wasn't only hot enough to kill, the dang things were on fire. And so if you think about it from an ignition threshold versus a just heating that would kill foliage, you're talking about from a Chad's not going to yell at me. If it's a 60-degree centigrade heating that causes a leaf to die, that's one thing. If it's 320 degrees C for ignition, and the dang thing was beyond ignition, it's flaming, that's really, really hot. And so it's likely that not just the leaves were consumed, but the buds were killed, and likely that the branches also suffered pretty substantial injury. And so it's systemic injury, and it may even be, and what our thought for crown consumption is, there's also likely some mold damage. There's also some vascular injury. Crown kill in this sort of middle level where we have meristem death, but not consumption, meaning there's probably no branch or bole injury. And then crown scorch that is actually pretty light and lots of species can handle it. Is this how things actually work? I look at this every day. The 3, 4, 5 of you that have been to Tall Timbers, if you've ever seen me at Tall Timbers, what I do every day is walk around and look at post-fire injury. I'm on the telephone making some big deals, and I'm just looking at injury going, that doesn't really fall into my 3 neat categories. Nature is pretty diverse, and individual species are also really diverse. So this, what we thought as this revolutionary 3 different case model is actually much more diverse, likely in the field. Pointing to, we don't know that much about the number 1 predictor of mortality. We can't say why they die, and the number 1 predictor of mortality, we don't really know what's going on. Okay? We got issues with terminology, though it said, and then issues with measurement. The number 1 predictor of mortality, how do we measure it? Mike, you've measured this before. How do you measure this? Like, what would be the devices that you're using? What's that?
Let's make up a number. Well, we just look at the volume and make an assessment of how much.
That is ridiculous, isn't it? That is literally what we do. In 2023, what I used to say was, this was a 20th century or 19th century, I make a little joke and say it was a 19th century methodology. But, I mean, it's just an ocular estimation. It's not 19th century. This is like medieval. If you can go, once we came up with 0 to 100, when did we come up with percentage? That's how simple that model is. And so it's usually, and the methodology is, there are 2 observers, and those 2 observers are like an old married couple, and they argue and bicker in the field. So Michael and I would be in the field, and I would say, okay, Mike, what you got? And he'd say 70%, and I'd go, 70%? No, it's 55%. For the number 1 predictor of tree mortality. That is how we do it.
Okay, 62.
Yeah, and so that's how we end up. And then Mike and I would learn each other. This is what a longtime postdoc and I have done now, I figured out lately. He knows what I'm going to say, and so he loads his estimate higher, so we'll get to his number in the end.
Oh.
So we have some pretty severe issues with measurement. We'll come back to, and there's some cool work in this it's working on it. Okay, measurement difficult. The mechanism is also unclear. What causes the leaves to brown in that crown scorch category? If we just keep scorch and we forget about the kill and the consumption. Consumption's relatively straightforward. It's really, really hot. The dang things are on fire. That's going to kill them. What causes these leaves to drop? Because if you watch them slowly, if you have a high intensity of measurement, you will see, and Lauren knows this better than anybody in this room, the first day of the fire, I can see that they have a little bit of it looks like a J. Crew catalog. You call it army green, but it's really the olive drab, perhaps. There's a slight olive drab color, and it transitions over several days until it starts to appear brown or this orangish brown. And then those leaves in some species start to drop pretty rapidly. In longleaf pine, unfortunately for the species that I primarily work on, that process occurs from the heat to the leaf on the ground in about 6 weeks. Ponderosa pine, as all of you know that live here, lasts a long time. And so that apparent injury you can see for a long time. For us, as soon as the fire happens, my crew and I are on the clock. We're going, nope. That's not happening. We're not doing spring break because that's part of our post-fire measurement period. So we're trying to capture this as much as possible. What makes them do that? What is it that's been killed? And why doesn't it turn brown the first day? We don't know. We think right now, our hypothesis is that there is some cuticle melting going on, that heat melts the cuticle because that olive drab has a different reflection. And so maybe it's the melting. We don't even know that. That's how bad our field is right now. Okay, so let's just leave it behind. You understand how little we know. There are a lot of ecological questions unanswered here. What's the effect of this? I had a manager that I worked closely with who called me one time and said, they really scorched at the Soto National Forest in South Mississippi. This massive 4,000 acre burn unit, and they scorched the crap out of it. And we're worried because we're monitoring this rare plant in the understory. I was like, that's great for the rare plant. You just took out shade. This is fantastic news. He said, no, it's blanketed with litter. It is covered, the post-fire emerging plant is coated in this layer of litter because you just transformed all of the crown mass and you dumped it on the forest floor. You may have taken, what's in those leaves? A bunch of nitrogen. If you do a back of the envelope for how much nitrogen was in that crown or in this canopy, and you just dumped it on the forest floor, it starts to make fire and how these individual species are tolerating it really questionable. So we've also hypothesized from going through this and watching this occur that they're injured and the leaf is still attached because they haven't built an abscission layer, and they are likely retranslocating nutrients, just like in the autumn as they're pulling back those nutrients and we see dramatic color change. We see the same thing transpiring in fire. These plants have had a very long relationship with fire. Being able to retranslocate following fire probably works. We're measuring it right now. But nobody's ever found that. Something right in front of our face. It's just brown leaves. Let's move on. We'll come back and see if they're living or dead in 6 months. So lots of stuff to do. If you want to talk about this, I wanted to do a review of crown scorch, a review of boll heating, and a review of roots, but we're stuck on the crown because there's so many unanswered questions that we have to focus on for the next probably decade. All right, leave that behind. Let's look at stem injury, which has always been, if I asked you right now, what's classical adaptation for surviving fire if you're a tree? Go, what is it? Everyone will say the same, it's always bark. If it's children, if it's scientists that have looked at hundreds of thousands of individual trees and fire death, they will say, bark. And the data never show that. They never show this. On small trees, they show it, but on adult trees, they never show this. And our brains tend to be focused on this, on thin-barked and juvenile trees where lots of cambial injury occurs. We can see it, we can uncover it. And then on large trees, what we end up doing, and this is a shout out to Chad. Chad called and asked me about measuring char heights one time. And he said, should we do it? And I said, yeah. And he said, why? And I said, we don't know. We just continue to measure something that we know never comes out in the model as very descriptive, but it's really easy to measure, Chad. And so we had this moment that was this strange observation of how fire chars the boll. In the models, we find that boll char severity, depth, or the height of it never comes out as a primary and rarely comes out as a different secondary factor in mortality. Even though all of us said, bark, proudly, I would say bark too. I can't keep myself from saying it just like you are. There looks to be some cool stuff that is coming to start to look at this, because this idea of char severity, and that is a depth of consumption on the boll, does show a little promise. Sharon Hood has a couple papers showing that char severity adds a lot to an explanation of mortality. So there's some cool things that are almost using remote sensing, but using spectral reflectance to look at bark and try to understand better what's happening beneath the bark surface in the cambium. So there's some cool stuff. Stem injury, the paper that I would write, because I have to do it in haste because I'm focused so much on the crown now, it would be, do we have to focus on stem injury so much when the data never show this? Okay. At some point I will figure out that this does not work. All right, the third area is root injury. And I said sometimes the models include root injury, sometimes they don't. The way that we measure it is not with soil heating, what's actually happening and the mechanism for the stress. We measure it based on reduction in organic depth, the underlying fermentation and humus horizons, or the DUF. Because we know that that is related to below ground soil heating. It's easy to measure as long as you were there before and you can measure a difference. And it tends to be pretty strong in systems where fire has been excluded for a while. It's a very strong predictor. In frequently burned systems, it's meaningless because there is no DUF. DUF does not accumulate in the fire-free period. And there is some work that looks at depth of heating, but again, that's not only going before the fire to know what the depth was and then measuring after, that's measuring it during, and as we know, in spite of our best intentions, we rarely do that very well. And here's a classic image. This is infrared that you've all seen stuff like this of fires. This is interesting because this is longleaf pine in North Florida. This is an hour after the surface fire passed over. So the surface fire is long gone. What you're seeing here is, and if you see this surface temperature scale, you'd know it, right? Because we're below what might be in some ignition threshold. This is just warm, really, really warm surfaces. And you see there's a tree in the back over there, and there's a tree in the foreground here. That's just a big mound of basal duff that is subjecting the bowl to a little bit of heat. But just like with surface fires and injury, we find very little evidence that it actually girdles the tree. What we find evidence for is this heat does this. It kills roots. It kills superficial fine roots and also main channel roots. Main channel root mortality is like crown consumption. It's catastrophic. It's like damming a large river where the river is moving water and nutrients into the stem. So this matters again in fire excluded sites, but is inconsequential in frequently burned sites. Okay, those are those three areas. Okay, so as part of this, we said there needs to be a large database of post-fire injury and tree mortality. And so we went on, Alina Kanzler, a postdoc on this project, who's now a new professor at the University of Montana. She spent a ridiculous amount of time coalescing from several people in this room and others around the country, post-fire tree measurements. They had to have injury measurements from across the United States. We also have it across the world now, where we have injury and we tracked mortality for at least 2 years and hopefully 3 years, because that's the industry standard. We don't know why, okay? Just full disclosure, we don't know why. And so this is what the dang database looks like. The largest database of post-fire tree mortality in the world, 170-something thousand trees. That's the distribution. What do you see? The Western distribution sort of follows the distribution of forests, right? If you know where forests are in the West, that's it, right? It's sort of outlining it. You can see Nevada is sort of lacking. If you saw it, it'd be these little trickles, right? Little vertical trickles in the Basin Range. It looks pretty good for Oregon, although not complete cover. Washington, okay, it's got some spots that need some more. California, you can see the Sierras sticking out. Coast ranges are lagging. Klamath Mountains, Cascades look great. You can see all the forested spots in the West. How about for the East? For somebody who works in the East, at least half my career, what in the world is going on? This is my PhD right here. This is where we're working right now, and this is where we're working right now. That's the Osceola side, Chad. This is the Escambia side, Chad. And the East looks terrible. That's basically the fire and fire surrogate study sites that the Joint Fire Science Program supported and stopped supporting. That's where these sites are here. And they got a few rando spots. And you can see the sort of year, and I'll get to just the sample size for these, but that's pretty weak. 170,000 trees is a lot, but it's not like, you're gonna brag. I'm not gonna brag about it later tonight. 171,000, 170,000, it's pretty good. But again, you can see right now without looking at forest types or your favorite forest type, and each of you has some spot you look on a map and you're already going, wait a minute, like the Black Hills spot, that's where Mike looked first. I looked right here where I live and see nothing, where we're now doing this stuff. Anyway, so what does this thing do? So this is what the data set, what we're able to do is to look at the models using those injury variables and using bark thickness as measured by diameter for all species that we've measured it on in the United States. Okay, I'm gonna go through this in gory detail. Are you ready? Okay, here is the poster child for tree mortality research, where we have done more research than we probably ever should have on ponderosa pine. Just so happens you're in, this is a perfect territory for you. You can look at the distribution here. That green is the natural distribution. You see that in the background there? You can see, and you can see the dots where these studies, basically we blanketed that distribution. Yeah, we're missing a couple of spots. I mean, there's actually a little spot in the Puget Sound. We really did knock that one out. You could do that with the map. You could also look over here in this sort of climate space and see that there's some really, really hot spots that we probably should sample in. The orange dots are where we sample, the black is what's possible. So there's a little corner over here that we need to do more in. I mean, that's kind of easy, right? These places. But the rest of it, I mean, maybe there's something here that's pretty cool and gets intermediate precipitation. I mean, in general, that looks really, really good. Like we're covering that distribution really well. We'll talk about this in a second. Here is the dominant predictor, ground volume scorched in diameter, and the orange trees here are dead, the green are live. That's hard to see, but you can look at these on the sides and see general patterns. And so from a ground volume scorched, living trees tend to have really, really low mean ground volume scorched. Dead trees have really, really high. Okay, they're differentiating nicely. Live and dead here from a diameter standpoint, big trees tend to survive better than small trees. Those all make a lot of sense. Those are all marginal. The meat is the bottom two panels here. So this is probability of mortality and ground volume scorched, number one predictor. And what we have here is the observed and predicted by the model. The orange line is the model. The gray balls are the observed. That's awesome. I feel great right now. I was so down about physiologists not understanding this. We don't know why trees die. We don't know what happens with ground scorch. Who cares? Look how strong this bleeping model is. We got a little bit of something happening right there, but I mean, whatever. It's a hockey stick. You see the threshold happening. I can tell you with pretty great confidence, given that these measurements took place all over ponderosa pine's range, from super wet sites to super dry sites, hot sites to cold sites, and look how good the model is. This is what the first order fire effects model, what FES, what all decision support software uses this equation and generates mortality predictions for ponderosa pine. Feels so awesome right now. And then you look at it with tree size, and I still feel pretty good. You can see here we've got observed and predicted the same thing. Probability of mortality has small trees. This is like Battaglia et al. Something. And as they get larger, you see the probability of mortality goes down, boom, 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 perfect. And then something happens here. Why in the world does that thing take an upswing? DVH here, like we're taking a little, that's not, it should just do this, right? Why do you see that little uptick in mortality? Any guesses?
Long unburned.
Probably long unburned. Big trees have higher probabilities of mortality. They've always been a stress in ponderosa pine. In most species, large trees have all sorts of insults. They have lots of injuries. They tend to have accumulated injuries, and lots of studies will exclude them because they have a pre-existing injury, and we don't want it to bias the data set, even though that's actually the wrong thing to do. This happens in ponderosa, and it happens in sugar pine. It happens in most species. We'll see really, really big trees. Look at the size of these trees. I mean, bigger than a meter in diameter. I mean, whatever. Those are super rare. What you tend to see, though, is stuff that looks like this. This is one of the most dominant trees in the United States. It basically defines Eastern North America, white oak. Maybe you've heard of it. Look at the number of sites. You can see where they exist. There's the natural range of white oak. You can see here the climate space. Basically, we got warm, wet, and nothing else for white oak. If we look here, if you're paying attention now, we've got dead trees have lower crown volume scorch than the live trees. Hold on a second here. The dead trees have a small, okay, good, smaller DVH than the live trees. Okay, good. What in the world is going on right there? And then if you start to notice, remember the 38,000 trees? For all of white oak, there are 100 trees. This is an afternoon of sampling. It's really a full day, but it's basically an afternoon of sampling. And then you can, I don't have to explain how poor these are. They don't even converge. You never have a predicted overlap with the observed. I don't even know where to start with that. And this is not a trivial species. And so what we find is that many species have tiny data sets. They are missing major regions, sizes, et cetera. And the relationship between the modeled outcome and the observed outcome ends up being really poor. So we celebrated, got all cocky when I saw the ponderosa results, and the reality of the rest of the species brings us all down. Okay. So I think it's pretty easy. We have to recognize we have some major gaps. So I want to go through those a little bit more. This one is a major one. And there are folks in this room that are working on this issue right now. We have to figure out a better way to measure scorch. For tree mortality data sets, if you have something that is a rare occurrence and you have 100 trees, a couple trees dying gives you 2 trees to study why they died. That's ridiculous. You need really large data sets of living and dead trees. That's a classic problem in these sorts of data sets. And getting a lot of trees, if you're doing it like Mike and Morgan are, I mean, the old married couple now were exhausted with each other because we've been yelling at each other all day. Him saying 70, me saying 55, and us agreeing maybe it's 62.5, or is he loading his estimate? That's a terrible problem. What are our options for this? We could use some remote sensing. There are some problems with it. So this is using LiDAR, terrestrial laser scanning on small saplings. Shows some promise. What else do we do? Oh, look at that, Lauren. Just made it to the big time. We might be able to use lots of other remote sensing applications from the sky, from satellites or from drones. The problem with scorch is, and you can see it in a few of these tree crowns, is scorching occurs from below. And if we're above, unless we are at such a high density that we're getting from the side, then we lose some of the story. And what happens below, that is where consumption would take place. That is where crown kill would take place. And the top would be where scorch would take place. So it has some measurement problems. They're not insurmountable. They're just some measurement problems, which is cool, I think. Awesome, we got a measurement problem. Okay, check. Some folks are working on that. I love it. I've already pointed out that we have a poor physiological understanding of injury and just how these individuals refoliate, what actually causes them to die. Here's a long line from just out in the view. As they're quickly refoliating after 7 weeks of they're lost all their foliage and they're putting on new leaves. And this one's a damning one right here. Nobody even said it. I thought there'd be a walkout during this, because basically what have I been showing you? Bunch of stinking conifers. I did that white oak thing, but it's basically just been pictures of conifers. Sprouting is bad enough, and suckering is even worse. We don't have a genetic part of the model. We don't have anything about suckering in post-fire tree mortality models. We're basically looking at the survival, not top kill, the survival of the above ground structure. So they're built for non-sprouters, and they're mostly built for conifers and not angiosperms. That'd be fine if angiosperms weren't such badasses. The other part of it, and that maybe you have recognized, that if you use the decision support software, you enter in characteristic of an individual tree. That individual tree is existing by itself in the model. There's no competition in the model. From a biometrician standpoint, could you imagine us saying that competition doesn't matter for tree growth. Of course it does. It's basically how my whole field makes its living. You control competition. Competition matters. We know that this thing exists in the space of other individuals. We know that density-dependent mortality occurs. We have lots of evidence for it, and yet our models can't do it yet. We're working on this right now. We're jamming on spatial pattern of mortality and trying to look at effects of neighbors. Okay, it's not there right now. That's upsetting to you. I already mentioned it, but this whole modeling of binary outcomes is a real loser from an analytical standpoint. Not a lot of space to do anything very interesting. So we've been trying lots of different approaches over the last 5 years, taking data sets and doing other things with them to try to get at either, are there ways for us to generate continuous data? The eventual outcome is death or life. But on the way there are a lot of things happening with growth, with responses of defenses that all tend to be continuous, that we think that we have some good space to do stuff. We've looked at mortality in lots of ordination approaches to try to get it in different sorts of injury and where they put it in ordination space. We've got other techniques, and we've been spending quite a bit of time looking at medical literature where they're also interested in life or death. They want the quality of life in there as well, but life or death is the outcome they're focused on. So that's a real problem. Measurement problem and an analytical problem. That's cool for a field to have both of those. And we've got them all day long. The fundamental work on small tree mortality. That person is sitting in the back of the room. We have found, and others have found, and my animal friends think it's funny when I say it, small trees may die differently than large trees. To my forest friends, they think that's ridiculous and laughable and go, oh boy, he finally lost it. Like, what is fundamentally different about a small tree and a large tree? They're adults and subadults. But if they were animals, we would go, oh, the juveniles suffer all these other different stresses, whereas a sexually mature ones suffer very different stresses. We continue to find that mortality in small individuals happens at a different rate and happens at different intensity than large trees do, given some amount of injury, which is weird. It should be a little physical body with heat being distributed on it. Why in the world would they do something different? We don't know. And so this is, I think, provocative. It goes without saying that we need to measure fire better. All of these things, fire is not fire. There's a cute little backing fire there that is spitting through some hardwood leaves. Here's a smoldering fire here. And then we've got this central Utah tower that is there. And all of them in the model is fire. They may have some different aspects of intensity. We know that intensity is much more complex than is depicted in simple flame lengths. So there are a lot of problems there with fire, and we're all getting better at that right now. That's a large part of what Chad's mega grant has been working on, is measuring fire behavior better, in particular, measuring it as related to stress. This line, you're making it so big today. Here's a unit that Lauren has spent some time on. This is from above. You can see the lines of green trees, the patches of green trees. This all burned in a for southeastern fire, really intense prescribed fire. This is 12 to 20 foot flame lengths. For the southeast, that's really intense. Is this your first prescribed fire? So Lauren was, when it's your first fire, you always have to watch these people. And this is basically this modeled weird surface where showing green trees and brown trees, and we could all do the sort of Rorschach to figure out what's going on. We also know in these sites where ignition patterns were. And we know how strong ignition pattern is in how fires behave. And this kind of stuff is really just now starting to be acknowledged. So it's a huge part of what Chad and his collaborators are doing. And then one in some ways, I could kind of continue my career and do this. It's pretty easy. Got a good thing going. I can get funding to do this. I kind of like this. The title is easy. Every time I just write it, it would be a post-fire tree mortality model of minus echinata. I'm thinking about doing that right now. I'm actually measuring it in North Florida, USA. That's a solid Canadian Journal paper. I feel so good about that paper. It's going to get 9 or 10 citations over the next decade. That's all I need in this world. That's perfect. We do need these, but at some point you get pretty exhausted. Yes, we need this, but we need to go beyond this. And so what our work right now, this is the stuff that I'm most excited about, is using traits. And this speaks to the fire behavior and fire effects modelers, because what you want to be able to do is not make a new model for every species and every location, et cetera. What you'd like to be able to do is have the tree, the subject here, have some traits that are easily measurable that you can modify and let this thing run wherever you want it to run. And so we've been working with lots of different folks on lots of traits. When I was introduced, Gunnar said something about me working on flammability and fire adapted traits. A friend of mine recently said, "That's weird that you work in such two different areas." And I said, "You're just not paying attention. They're the same damn thing. We're just measuring traits, and that happens to be one of the traits we're getting to be able to do this, to be able to say, we can have them into gross categories, or we can figure out where those traits matter for survival and persistence, how they can tolerate heating differently. There are resilience traits that we're trying to now get to, and these interesting but often overmeasured sort of resistance traits. And this is the frontier, really, of where we're all headed. This is where we can talk to the fire ecologists, can talk to the fire behavior scientist, and we come to, oh, we're starting to explain fire effects. We can do it beyond just saying it's ponderosa pine, but we don't think the model will work in Douglas fir. That's an inadequate response to society. Okay. We're dealing with this. I don't want to say it because we're running late, but we're dealing with this too, okay? Basically, every answer we have is now starting to change. It's just going to get worse. Anyway, we are hoping that what we're doing, and this team has been working closely with the producers of all these decision support models to try to get to better decision support tools. That's also a cool aspect. We got a measurement problem, got an analytical problem, we got a physiological problem, and we have a decision support tool problem. Those are all great problems for a field to have. And I hope that that is evident. I hope that you're excited about it and you see how some of your work may fall into this. And I hope to discuss this stuff with you later. Thanks.
Thanks, Morgan. We have time for probably one question. No pressure.
So if there's so few data on oaks, for example, how do they make the predictive model in the first place?
They're using the bark thickness model, and in that distribution of those sites in the southeast or in the east, you see a few that fall out of fire and fire surrogate study sites. There's one in Arkansas that's a really awesome data set. The problem with hardwoods, in addition to there being very little data, they're using a model that they're just taking. The model was developed for Douglas fir and ponderosa pine and then put onto the hardwoods. The best model we have in the southeast is from Arkansas, and crown scorch is not the predictor. Why is that? They're on hardwoods. Why is crown scorch not the predictor? Because they burn it when it's dormant. So it brings up all of these massive issues. So it's the best model, and we don't even have the best term in the model because we're not able to measure that term. So there's all sorts of, hardwoods are fascinating for so many different reasons. They tend to defy the models really, really, in a gross way. And then when you start to look at where the data actually are for the hardwoods, they usually aren't there at all.
Well, thank you again, Morgan. There's a happy hour at Avogadro's if you want to hang out with Morgan and ask him more questions. But let's thank him one more time for his great presentation today.